Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to today's panel of Staging Queer Acts, Theatre, Space Making and Narratives of Joy. I'm really happy to be facilitating this conversation with Philip McMahon from This Is Pop Baby, Jamie Bigley and myself about staging queer narratives in theatre, diversifying experience and how theatre can represent a community effectively. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce the three of us so that you have a sense of who we are, although I think our first panelist probably needs no introduction. So first up, we have Philip McMahon, who is a playwright and theatre director based in Dublin. His most recent play, Come On Home, directed by Olivier Award winner Rachel O'Riordan, played a sold-out season at the Abbey Theatre Dublin in 2018. Philip is one half of pop culture outfit and theatre renegades This Is Pop Baby, based in Dublin, and he is also an artistic associate at the Lyric Hammersmith Theatre. Jamie Bigley is a PhD candidate at the Centre for Drama, Theatre and Performance at NUI Galway, and his work focuses on queer resilience, theatre and decentering reproductive versions of future making. I'm Dr Ciara Murphy. I'm a lecturer in creative arts teaching and learning here at NUI Galway. My own research deals with performances of social change, and I'm kind of here to facilitate and direct this conversation in a very light way. So how it's going to work today is we're going to keep it nice and casual, nice and conversational, and you as our participants, and you're very welcome, are welcome to contribute any questions, any comments that you might have in the chat box, and I will kind of come to those in real time to sort of facilitate that kind of conversational aspect as well. We're being moderated by our very talented technical manager, Sarah Hoover, who you can drop a chat message to if you're experiencing any technical difficulties at all. So I think we might get started with a little bit of a broad question, but I suppose something that kind of captures, I suppose, the conversation around what we're kind of having today and those intersections between our practice and our research. So I'm wondering about social change and the kind of intervention that theatre can make in kind of developing that. What happens after the curtain drops, and how conceivable is it, do you think, that theatre can actually make a change in society? So Jamie, can I come to you first before I circle back around to Philip?
Yeah, of course you can. I suppose for me, it's kind of a tough question. Like, I sort of come from an applied theatre background, so I've done work in theatre and health, and I've done work in disability arts as well before I came to NUIG. And I suppose whenever you come from that kind of background, there is this insistence that, oh, theatre is something that is important. It's something that improves the lives and the well-being of its participants. It's this, it's that, it's the other. And I think as an industry in general, we sort of have to keep that conversation going and saying how important the arts is across the board, and how much that we sort of intersect art and arts practice with so many other kind of institutions. So within education, within healthcare, within like broad social issue, and within politics. But I think in terms of how effective is theatre in itself, it's kind of hard to say. I think a singular intervention from a singular group at a singular time is not enough to make massive change. And I think keeping that within our heads at all times, whenever we're doing facilitation work, whether we're making performances, whether we're engaging with art as audience members or participants or whatever, I think is an important point. I suppose it's really about, are we the right people at any point to make the change? So like, I believe it is, who is it? It's within the, oh God, Danny Snyder-Young, that's who I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of Danny Snyder-Young. So she sort of discusses this idea of like, okay, theatre's great and theatre's wonderful, but is theatre always necessarily the right thing? You know, is your position as a theatre maker more useful to this community, or more useful to this group, or more useful to this individual than a doctor or a lawyer or somebody that is able to legislate and advocate for that person or that group? And in some cases it's a no, but I think theatre has a way of supporting that claim, and a way of making visible a lot of the things that we see. I think that's as much as I can get out of that.
No, and I understand, I suppose, that sort of tension, I suppose, and the kind of the questions that like Snyder Young raises around form and kind of process, and how we kind of get to that endpoint. And I suppose the same question to you, Philip, like, you know, how conceivable is it, I suppose, that theatre can sort of like intervene in society in this way?
Yeah, so I guess, you know, theatre makers like myself will say, oh yes, everybody will leave the theatre changed every time, and that will have a knock-on effect. And, you know, and that's kind of a, you know, that's a big idea. And it's, you know, it is not never true, but it's not very often true. But I do believe that theatre can affect change, and does affect change. And sometimes it's really incremental, and sometimes it's really obvious. And certainly for us in This Is Pop Baby, we've become really interested in how theatre will affect social change. And we've become much more invested in and interested in social issues. And a lot of that was shaped for us around our involvement in the campaigns for marriage equality and to repeal the Eighth Amendment. But before I kind of come to that, I might talk about kind of, you know, our theatre is born out of, you know, club culture and messy performance and alternative Miss Ireland, and places where people came together to see and share performance. I think the Stephen Quinn in the attendees there is Stephen Quinn of Spicebag, and Stephen's also of the same sort of tribe, which is that, you know, where there is kind of queer, messy performance, whether that is a drag show, whether it's Alternative Miss Ireland, where it's Spice Bag, where we gather in these rooms to see kind of crazy out there performance, we're building value systems in that room. You know, we're sharing things, we're talking about, you know, often, you know, while spilling pints over, we're kind of talking about equality and social equity, and all those value systems are cooked up in those rooms, and that is so valuable. And you know, and it's what's so great about a lot of queer spaces as well, is that you know, kind of clubs specifically, or night clubbing, like kind of rave culture and stuff like that, the value systems are built on those dance floors because it's about essentially being sound, right? And so your politics kind of spring from a kind of a really good baseline. For us, in terms of, you know, how we might affect social change, I guess, you know, I directed and presented a show with Tara Flynn called Not a Funny Word, about her lived experience around abortion, and we presented that in the run-up to the campaign. And there was a sense certainly there that people felt, well, if they couldn't have the conversation with somebody at home, perhaps they could bring them to the show and hear, and therefore the story was abstracted for them because there was an actor on stage telling the story, a lived experience. And again, with Riot, in terms of the kind of the politics around building community and about how we might slow down the negativity in the world. You know, we hope people left, you know, people found that a really cathartic experience. They leave, and incrementally you think, oh, people might make positive changes in their lives or the world, you know. Now they do that for loads of reasons or in life. So theatre is just one of them. However, there is one time where I saw theatre actively affect change very quickly. And it's when Panty made her Noble Call speech at the Abbey. And it was kind of accidental in a way. And we showed up to do that gig, and Panty was kind of half prepared, and you know, it was an addendum to the show that was on. And actually, one of the Jan, who works in the Abbey, he had actually filmed it on his phone, the thing, and like we left and we said, oh well, that was great, you were brilliant, and we went and, you know, drank gin. But Jan had posted this video, his iPhone video, on whatever the platform was at the time, and, you know, before we had kind of 3 drinks down, there was 2,000 hits, and we were like, oh. And so Conor Horgan, who was accidentally shooting Queen of Ireland at the time, I said, well, I've got better footage of it, should we put the video up tonight or tomorrow or whatever? And I think that you can, and so then that went crazy. We all know what happened to that. But I think, again, people were able to access the queer experience through this drag queen telling her personal story in the most eloquent way ever. You know, what's really interesting is that Rory always talks about, you know, if he had have been Rory there in a check shirt and trainers, nobody would have heard that speech, you know. And so there was something just magic happened in that room tonight. It was accidental that there was professional filmmakers there filming it. And I think that you can trace the line between that speech and several things that happened next.
Yeah.
And so I think that we hang out for those moments.
Yeah, there's so much in that. And I don't want to like jump forward too far in the conversation, but there is a few kind of threads that I want to kind of pick up on there. I think, you know, it's interesting that we are sitting here in a week which is the anniversary of both of those events of repeal and marriage equality votes in May 2015 and 18. And I'm always struck in my own research and kind of analysing the kind of like relationship between performance and society about how much events can kind of, and performances can kind of synthesize around what is happening kind of socially, and those kind of accidental moments where something just kind of gets that traction or has that kind of very like kind of deep affect for an audience is sort of informed about everything else that kind of comes around. And it kind of leads back to what you were saying, Philip, about, you know, just kind of the politics of kind of like being sound and the sort of value systems and the kind of process building that goes on in the kind of communities that create work like this. Those conversations that are happening in rooms are becoming part of the kind of like practice process, and then are kind of like coming out in things that are kind of accidental, like Panty's Noble Call, like your own work. But then actually, because those conversations, and maybe I'm wrong, but I wonder, is it the fact that those conversations are happening in the process with the people? It's going into the practice, and then it's like this kind of like vein of kind of like of a value system that actually comes through in the work then, and that's what people are picking up on. It's sort of like, I hate throwing around that word kind of authenticity, but because it comes from an authentic space of creating and curating these value systems, do you think that that's perhaps what people are kind of picking up on, those kind of authentic moments of kind of connectivity?
100%. I think that you know, if we, you know, you go on your holidays to Lisbon and you go into some queer art space where there's a show happening and you don't know what they're saying on stage, but you can feel the love and affection and authenticity in the room, and you kind of get swept along. And I think that a lot of queer performance spaces offer that. It's a safe space for a lot of people, and it's a space where big ideas are discussed, you know, while glitter is raining on it. And I think that that's really special. And I think that what queer work specifically offers is to kind of give people this insight into the underground or into subcultures. And I think that, you know, what has happened because of marriage equality and since is that much of that stuff has been mainstreamed, and it's been really good in a way for you know, a lot of people, for us all to have our kind of moment in the light. But the struggle then is about, well, how do you fight against that now and remain true to ourselves and to the kind of the underground nature. But yes, I think that you're offering people this world that they don't know. I think, like, you know, I think, like, for instance, for us, our shows can be received on loads of levels, and there is the This Is Pop Baby audience that have been with us since day one. They will go to most anything that we do. If we say, trust us, come, and we can, you know, and we cover all sorts of topics. But some people will receive Riot, for instance, as, oh, the crazy drag show with the circus performers. Great. why not? Because they just kind of feel like it's something different. And it is to a lot of people. And for us, we get to celebrate, like, for instance, with Riot specifically, we gathered and collected these people like moss over years, and then found the outlet to put them all into one show. And these are kind of, you know, very niche specific performers. And then you kind of get to celebrate them on big stages, and which is kind of magic. Did I answer a question there? I said a lot of things, sorry.
No, you did. And I want to kind of pick up on this idea of mainstreaming, Jamie, maybe with you, because I know that we've sort of had conversations around what happens when the radical and the way it's, and the kind of radical nature in which it's kind of created in the process that happens. What happens when all of a sudden we are like 6 years down the line, and maybe there's sort of different stories that need to be told, or maybe with the kind of mainstreaming of kind of queer work and queer art, maybe we don't need to rely on those kind of narratives of trauma as much, for example. Like, I think what you had made the case for an idea of kind of like a queer mediocrity, and, you know, to actually not have, you know, queer artists having to represent the entire community, that it's a part of kind of like art and performance and practice, but it doesn't always have to offer that sort of like deep catharsis, that sometimes like the radical act can just be making work that happens to be queer, as opposed to having to make a sort of like political intervention.
Yeah, I can't take credit for the queer mediocrity. I give total credit to Tabby Lamb for that one, because that's definitely a tabbyism. But I think it's a really good like starting point to think, okay, it'd be really nice for us not to have to constantly try to make the most polished, most evocative piece of performance that says so much about who we are and who we are as a community and who we are as a people and everything about the queer experience. It would be nice just to put together something that is kind of dull and dumb and is like a 3-star. So I think that's always a good place. But I think in terms of the work that we do within queer performance, it is very much like we have to be representational for everybody. And if we fail, then we failed everybody, because we're kind of the visible performers within maybe a mainstream space, for example. So like what happens there, I think, is the bigger question. It's like, are you failing an entire community basically by putting on something that's a bit naff? And honestly, it's not. I would argue not. I think there's definitely an aesthetic, like a taste level. I think Philly and I have been talking about taste levels, and my taste level is still to be determined, whether or not it's good or bad. But
that was not my assessment, FYI. That's at all.
I've been very close to my chest because I didn't want to thinking I was bigging up terrible performances.
What role do you think that, like, say, critics or scholars or researchers have in sort of assessing and kind of placing queer work in certain spaces with certain narratives, and kind of, you know, because there's a lot of framing that goes on of queer work where the intentionality behind it may not have been to sort of like represent or be representative of an entire community, but perhaps like the way that criticism is recorded, like in broadsheets or online, or the way that kind of like researchers or scholars or academics engage with it, can have a, you know, in the way that performance kind of lives on through these writings. Like, what is the role, do you think, or what kind of tensions are at play there?
I mean, I was thinking about this today actually, and I was thinking about, I could make a statement about whatever. So I could say something like, Kristen Stewart is the most influential actor of the 21st century, right? I could say something like that. Do I believe it? It doesn't really matter. If I have enough authority as, say, an academic, if I have enough authority as an academic from being well known within that circle, from having multiple publications to back up my authority, then I can sort of come at this with a place of authority. So like the statement itself doesn't really matter. It's more about my positionality, I think is the really interesting thing there. So like we can dig up old queer work and go through the archives and go through the canon and look at the people that have been forgotten, and we've seen a lot of that through this festival. Just different productions and different playwrights that weren't well received in their time, but we find significance about their work now. And whether that is kind of us trying to dig up a sense of significance or trying to hold them up because of our own position and because of, I suppose, what the outside perspective of academia is, we're almost like the tastemakers of of art. We're considered to be like, oh, you know, we know what art is because we know the theory behind it, which in a lot of instances I don't know if it's true. I mean, I'm an academic and my taste level's interesting, but you know, whether we're digging that up and holding it up because of our position, or whether the work itself deserves that praise and was really revolutionary, was really transgressive for the time, is a really kind of sticky question to ask. But I think this is the wonder of like queerness and queer theory, is the fact that it never quite sticks. It's always about, well, for me anyway, it's always about making things strange again. I think this goes back to the idea of like queer performance becoming mainstream. I don't think that it necessarily becomes mainstream forever. I think that we find a new way to make it transgressive and make it radical and make it anti-capitalist or antisocial again. I'd say antisocial. There's always going to be that play because we're always responding to what is happening in the wider world, and we're always using our own stories to transgress those things and ask the questions about the ideologies that we hold so I suppose statically, and say, but why do we think that, or why do we say that, or why do we do that, and to whom does that most benefit? And I think that's, for me, that's what the queer performance is all about.
Thank you. And Philip, just like, I'm always interested, I think, in that sort of tension that exists between criticism and performance. And I'm talking about like journalistic criticism now at this point. And I know, you know, like, in your opinion, and not to put you on the spot, like, how do you think queer work is, like, do you think there's a parity of discourse around how queer work is kind of criticized and engaged with in an Irish context?
Well, there's a lot to say on this topic, but I might jump back first to just say about the kind of the role that academics kind of play in this. For us, it's like, it's been, you know, we come as makers, we came first as makers who were just reflecting our own lives with no agenda and no sense of, you know, the term queer theory had not even entered our lexicon at all. And so academics became really important in helping us to reflect on the work. And, you know, and when people write about the work, you kind of go, oh, right, okay, these are the things that were kind of subconsciously happening, but I, you know, wasn't naming them, it didn't have to name them or whatever. So that's always really valuable, as is criticism, except that criticism is is such a fleeting moment, and as such a, you know, a word count and a star system, that it seems almost too rigid to in any way, you know, to properly engage with queer work or with theatre, you know. And I say that with the good, bad, and middling reviews, of which there have been a healthy amount of all. But I don't see any, you know, if anything, what I have seen, you know, over the years, is people be too careful with queer work when criticizing it. It doesn't make them give an extra star or anything, but but I think there is a tiptoeing around the politics, and sometimes that's right, because you kind of go, well, look, I want to get it right, and so yeah, so there is always, you know, queer, not queer, you know, in theatre, there's always a tension between what the critics are seeing and writing and what you're making, because really, you know, often you read these things even when they're shining, you kind of go, oh, if I could have just had you see it from that angle, from where I was given it. And what I do find with queer work, there's a better way to frame this, right? But I'm just going to say it, and it's on record, whatever. Is that with queer work, queer play specifically, is that straight people want to see straightness in it. And I found that a lot in my play Come On Home, and this is not necessarily from criticism, but from reactions where people go, oh, well, the straight brother who had the trauma, like that's what the show was about. And you're kind of going, well, no, it actually wasn't. Like, yes, that was in it. Like, and people really want you to tell their story. In the same way, queers, we want people to tell our stories, just that nobody did. Yeah. And so it's kind of just like always with criticism, you kind of go, I wish I could have brought you through the kaleidoscope of my mind and this beautiful process we went on and the discoveries we made, and then we kind of made this beautiful thing. And that just is not possible. And so we kind of have to appreciate, live with, and crave criticism, because if if the shows are not being written about, they're not being recorded, and there should perhaps be more dialogue. If there wasn't like 5 reviewers in Ireland, there could potentially be more dialogue around, well, what are the reviews saying, and how do we respond to reviews, and how can you have a kind of an interesting and healthy dialogue with reviewers and stuff like that. But yeah. No, I think necessary is, necessary, yeah, and wanted ultimately.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I obviously, like being a theater reviewer, I have to sort of name my sort of interest here, but yeah, I am sort of constantly struck, and I think you and I had this conversation on Twitter a while back about the star rating system and what a blunt instrument it is. I mean, yeah, truly. But also you're kind of right, I think, in that I think the lens in which work this is what I've been thinking about a lot recently, is the sort of lenses in which work is framed. So we know about the sort of ephemerality of theatre and practice, and I suppose in the last kind of 18 months our perspectives may have kind of shifted on that slightly, but oftentimes the way that queer work is preserved or not is not directed or kind of decided on by queer people. And there, I think it's fair to say, and I'm going to put this on the record, that the theatre critics in Ireland are sort of hegemonic grouping in mostly in that regard. And I think we are all white, and there's a sort of there's sort of tensions that are sort of created out of that. And I think you can see kind of similar sort of hegemonies in the academic lens to who writes about queer work and in what ways it's viewed. And I was interested, Philip, in what you were saying about how I just want to get them and sort of tilt their perspective this way so that they're kind of viewing it through the sort of intention that I kind of created it with, and how perhaps there's something about the kind of framing there that's difficult. And to kind of pick up on what you were saying there about Come On Home and this idea of sort of people want to see themselves represented back on stage, okay? I think it's sort of fair to say that straight people get to see that most of the time. So when you are sort of dealing with kind of queer spaces and sort of sharing that, especially on the national stage, then there's all these other kind of tensions that emerge as well. In your own work, I suppose, this idea of the kind of of the joy making, and really this is what this kind of panel is around, kind of is about, is what does it mean to claim joyful queer space in performance, and to kind of not be so conscious of that sort of kind of attempting to frame it for a constituency, maybe not that they can't, not that it's not appreciated, but just to actually unapologetically and radically kind of claim that joyful space, and not to kind of adhere to expectations around what queer theatre is as this sort of as a concept or a process. I wonder what you think about that. Is that something you're conscious of?
Yeah, I think we have a very specific canon that we work into in Ireland, don't we, in terms of the types of drama that we create for the stages. And often, whether it's gay, straight, or beyond, we tend to talk about trauma a lot on stage because we kind of have a history of trauma in this country, and of all sorts, and including, you know, sexual shame and repression and all, like, I don't need to tell everybody what the national trauma is. And so for when queer stories arrive, and especially on our main stages, it often feels pressing to discuss those traumas. It often feels like this is our opportunity to say these things out loud. And I have found that the more kind of the unabashed kind of joyful queerness, that the theatre is not always equipped to hold that. Like, so for instance, when we met, it exists in Riot, right? And Riot is a variety show that happens in big venues or a Spiegel tent. It happens at Spice Bag, which is a mixed performance, you know, predominantly queer audience space. And so that's kind of easier because, you know, you start talking about your trauma to, you know, within queer spaces, people are like, all right, get on with it, play the next track, you know. And so I feel like that we have had a balance of that work, but really the kind of celebrating ourselves and our queerness, and we have found that kind of club spaces, variety spaces have been easier to achieve that. However, I guess, you know, Alice in Funderland is something that was, you know, that we would consider a queering of the Alice books, of our own kind of citizenship of Dublin and of the Abbey stage. And even though that kind of suggested at dark places, it was a pretty joyful evening at the theatre, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Jamie, do you want to come in on any of that around this idea, I suppose, like, you know, queer joy and making work that reflects that?
Yeah. I suppose for me, I'm coming at it from just the general productions that come into my head in terms of a queer canon, we'll say, and I mean, they're very American, but I think of Angels in America, I think of The Normal Heart, I think of The Laramie Project, and they're all, you know, very much to deal with trauma. They're very much to deal with sort of very real lived issues, and they're all incredibly important. But I also think in terms of the work that like newly emerging queer artists are making, we tend to focus maybe towards autobiographical, and we tend to focus towards sort of displaying the trauma. And I almost think of that like kind of like lacerating yourself and bleeding out on a stage for the sake of cis het people to be like, wow, wasn't that really brave and wasn't that really lovely? Like there's a book by Matt Hargreaves called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and it's specifically about disability theatre, and it's about the aesthetics of disability theatre. But he challenges us as readers and as audiences to get past the awe factor, to not see the disability in front of us and say, oh, isn't it great that they're able to do that in spite of. I think if we keep the sort of trauma as a center point, and we focus on trauma as the thematic focal point for an entire piece, it does become that kind of repetitious act of saying, oh, isn't it, you know, so hard to be queer? Isn't it so hard to be gay? Isn't it so hard to be trans? Isn't it so hard to be this, that, and the other? And for me, I think the joyfulness angle, and the angle that I really want to delve into as a theatre maker, because the stuff I write falls into that pattern. I'm writing into things like mental health, and I'm writing into things like gender identity and the traumas around that. And I say trauma very liberal because I'm a white person. My trauma is not that horrible. But I wonder how much the joyfulness is in and of itself a really liberating point. You know, you're kind of denying a heteronormative audience the thrill of watching you display your trauma. You're sort of saying, no, I'm not giving you this, or I will talk about these things that directly affect me. I will talk about the the world that exists outside and how I navigate that world. But I'm not going to give you it in a kind of sad, depressing story, possibly with some sort of movement sequence in the middle to a little piano ballad.
Stop giving us ideas, please.
Yes.
I mean, but I think that is really, really wonderful, and I think the idea of like coming out of that with the joyfulness as the centerpiece, and kind of digging deeper than just making gender and sexuality the focal point and the thematic point of any character, like even in terms of just a singular queer character in a larger cast. Like, what is their purpose of being on that stage if not just to be the kind of, not to be relational to the other characters, but not necessarily gain anything by the end of it. Like, I think like the gay best friend trope within like romantic comedies and stuff, like, you know, they don't really gain anything by the end of it. They're just sort of there as the kind of comedic gesture character. So they're very rarely ever fleshed out. And then I think whenever we do decide to flesh people out, they delve into trauma. But I think you know, even as I think about how I might produce work in the future and working with different queer individuals, I think being able to offer them that space to discuss trauma is great, but also being able to offer them the space to go past that and not have to make the work about that in order for it to be good work.
Yeah.
Is really, really important.
Yeah, and I wonder. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I imagine we're going to see a whole new coming generations of work that don't feel obsessed with trauma, or don't feel like that they're carrying the burden of that, or that they're kind of exercising themselves of that. So, you know, yeah. Sorry, Ciara, go ahead.
No, I was just like, I often wonder about just the structures. And so I kind of think I've been reflecting a lot on the marriage equality campaign, and I've been reflecting a lot on the repeal campaign, as I do every week, and I probably will every week this May for the rest of my life, about the permission granting that had to happen in both of those instances. You know, the kind of structures of, and I wonder, is this the kind of structure we deal with in Ireland, whereby queer people and women and pregnant people had to basically go to the rest of the population and ask permission for essentially what is a human right, and the way we could kind of justify our own existences in doing that, and to justify being permitted to have what we were asking for, was to share our stories of trauma, of difficulty, and to put them on the very public stages of the theaters, but to also like bring them to the public kind of performance spaces of doorsteps and canvassing and things like that. And so it's natural that sort of echoed, I think, in the sort of like structures of performance practice, because, you know, I do believe that performance practice and society, there's kind of paradigms that are kind of shared there. But I also wonder about the sort of limitations that kind of puts on us. Then do we by kind of doing that kind of shared storytelling, by having to expose ourselves, have we kind of created a habit, I suppose, in that people expect any story about that, about being queer, about kind of claiming space to reflect that trauma, you know? And I think about kind of funding structures as well, you know, around like, you know, the commemorative structures. When something is happening and it's big, a lot of the funding that's offered is sort of contingent oftentimes on engaging with sort of certain themes, and to kind of like satisfy that sort of like social need, or that sort of audience need for something that's commemorating something, or that's reflecting on something deeply. And so I wonder, Philip, when you're sort of applying for things, then do you sort of feel hampered by, I suppose, expectations around sort of like grant funding, or are you able to kind of subvert those sort of expectations once you're actually like in the process of kind of like making that work?
Yeah, I think that you are, like, first of all, I think that like theatre in Ireland has a kind of cyclical quality. You know, we're not seeing a lot of cross-pollination of shows. We're not seeing, you know, we don't see a lot of you know, Royal Court or Bush style plays visiting here or anything like that. And so queer stories and, you know, other stories tend to, you know, reflect back on what they have seen. And so you get a lot of similar stories. And I guess what's interesting for us as we become kind of more interested in social issues and how we might play our part or affect change is how we can leverage our queerness for kind of other issues. And and I guess for us, talking about direct provisions and migrant stories and how queers might show up for others in the way that other groups showed up for us. And so it's but I think that the kind of queer narrative running up to, during, post marriage equality is complicated, because we were all asked to get on board, and you had to flatten out any kind of questions you had around marriage as an institution, because we had to get this thing over the line, and it was the right thing to do, because equal rights is equal rights. But there is a sense now of that gaze, that there's a sense of there's a sense now of the good gays and the bad gays. Mm-hmm. And the good gays are going, well, we have our marriage, and I'm able to go on my Spanish holiday with my wider family, and we're gonna we're having kids and all of that. And the bad gays are going, well, fuck that. I'm not actually, I'm ready to go back underground now that I come up to give you a hand. And I want to do the things that I want to do down here, so there's there is a tension there. And for me specifically, in the work that we're looking at right now, and have been for the last, we just completed a work in progress of a piece about chemsex, because there are kind of unseen parts of the queer community that are being left unseen, and I think that we have a history, including marriage equality, including the AIDS crisis, throughout our civil rights movements, of queers showing up for each other. And there are issues like chemsex, for instance, where people are not showing up for each other. And I think that we're kind of interested now. I don't go into a project thinking this is going to be traumatic or this is going to be joyful. And I think that if you can tell a story with authenticity and make it excellent theater, that in loads of ways that doesn't matter. Of course, when people come out crying or joyful, you take note and you go, that's what that was. But I think it's important for me as a maker, and for somebody who would identify as queer with a capital Q, is about how we continue to look into kind of dark corners of our community, how we with a view to helping, or to kind of create in dialogue, and to not kind of stick with the narrative that we are now. I think that the gays are sorted. Well, and I think that the rest of society will go, well, what's your problem? Didn't we all vote that and you got like overwhelming majority? Like, what is the problem now? And of course there is a lot of marriage equality, was the band-aid, and all of that trauma seeps out, it comes out, it finds its way out. And I think that we have to keep discussing that. So yeah.
Yeah. And what about the theatre as a space for that then? We're in the business of theatre making and kind of conceiving of that, but what do you think the theatre can do as a space of sort of like openness and access? Like, what makes the theatre a good place to come and explore those narratives, or to sort of like unfurl what's been hidden previously, do you think?
For makers, what makes it a good space for makers? I guess for me, it's like I make shows. That is what I do, and so there is nothing else that I know of that I can do, and so that is the space for me where I do come and discuss these things. And I guess for me, when I started making work in the mid 2000s, reflecting on it, I didn't quite realize there how homophobic theatre was, that the institutions and all of the, I guess it was a homophobic place to make work. And that sounds like, how could that be possible? When the theatre is the breeding ground for every lovey, you know, going. But it just kind of was, and there was a sense of that the gays that had any position of power, or that were well-known actors or that kind of thing, there was almost like that they were kind of repressing themselves in order to, you know, if they wanted to excel in their career, or if they, you know, there was a lot of people who were kind of working on the down low or whatever. And then that also became, so then the gays were also kind of homophobic to each other. And I guess for me, when I started making work, I kind of very quickly thought, well, I don't have an education. I don't have any credentials beyond, you know, I'm willing to get up there and give it a shot. So I can only be true to my own experience, and I can only make theatre that I feel like I'm not seeing on stages. And of course, you solidify that idea over time. At first, you're like, I want to put out a drag show. But you solidify that over time, and it became important for me. You know, I don't think nobody is going to check, but I don't think that any of my 11 plays, they all have queer characters in them somewhere. And that was important for me, just to place people that in, even if it was about women in the flats in Ballymun, that queers were placed there. And so for me, it's always been somewhere, I hope that we have been part of the change inside the institutions to attitudes, because I think that it is better for queers now. I think that there's a huge appetite. I think specifically, you know, Panty's work on the stage kind of cracked something, and there was a huge appetite for queer stories on the stage. I think that trans people and non-binary people telling their stories has helped us to move the needle again. And I think there is an appetite for people to commission that work, and we know there is an appetite to see it. So I think that we have also gone through a great change in the theatre. But I think that by its very nature of how, you know, you're putting people in a room to share ideas and to build something, it's an excellent place to discuss queer stories and to figure them out, and to kind of, and also to allow your own opinions on things to move and change, and to bounce them against an audience and see what comes back at you. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. And I mean, I have had my mind change at theatre for sure, or I've had curtains pulled back, and I've seen things that maybe I should have been more aware, you know, like I'm like, okay, I've seen this now, I need to know more. And I also feel like this is a comfortable space. Like I'm comfortable in the theatre, sitting here expecting to kind of be interacted with, or to have that kind of audience performance relationship. So this is a nice place for me to come and to kind of experience something. And Jamie, I suppose, and anyone in the audience, please feel free, if you have any comments or questions, to pop them in the chat. But I'm wondering for you, as like, so Philip has come at it from Maker. I'm wondering for you, like being an audience member at theatre, like what is the benefit of theatre as a space for the queer audience member?
I suppose it really depends on the work that you're seeing. So if I'm going to a fringe production that is very much aimed for the queers, I'm in a room with a load of people that are like directly impacted or have some sort of feeling towards the piece that's being presented, right? So I'm experiencing that with an audience that has, to some degree, a certain amount of knowledge or experience of the stories that are being presented. If I'm going to something that is marketed more towards a generic audience, then I suppose I'm the eye in the room that is queering the performance itself. Mm-hmm. So I'm coming at this from a perspective that maybe other audience members aren't. And I suppose that's the point for me as an audience member, but then also I suppose as an academic, to be able to state that and be like, I am viewing this from a queer positionality, and my interpretation of the work and my interpretation of the themes and the importance of certain characters or certain aspects of the show will differ, and you know, maybe they might be missed, or maybe they might be kind of lost to the ether as we move forward. And I suppose, you know, we've been talking about the canon and archivalness. And I think Martin was here at one stage potentially, but he had spoken really well about the idea that, you know, not everything about queerness is written down in these archives. Like, we don't necessarily keep a lot of artifacts. A lot of our histories are based in orality and based in the community itself. It's kind of a living history, or I think it's Sedgwick calls it the archive of emotion. So we sort of carry that with us, and we learn from the elders, and we learn from the people that come before us, almost like a family unit, or a genealogy nearly. But I suppose from an audience perspective, that's kind of what I'm pulling away, as well as just being able to sense that the theatre itself for me is this utopian space where we can make realities in really interesting ways. So this is why we can bring up these issues, because maybe outside of the theatre, in a general setting, these things are not said, or there's a lot of things that should be said that aren't. Whereas within theatre, we can make those invisible or kind of muted conversations more vocal and more visible.
Yeah.
Thank
you. This actually brings us nicely into a question we have around kind of space and scarcity, and, you know, where do we have space to sort of explore things that are messier? And Stephen Quinn has asked you both, Philip, I might come to you first on this. Could you speak about the scarcity of spaces for messy, non-commercial queer work in Dublin before the lockdown?
Yeah, I think, you know, Dublin is bereft of spaces. Like, you know, that is just the truth of the matter. And so then you kind of go, you know, where are the queer spaces? Where can you do something cheaply? And, you know, insurance, and like, so there's a load of issues around, you know, getting space. You know, Stephen runs a brilliant night called Spice Bag, which is done in many spaces, but in the Working Men's Club just opposite Panty Bar, which is kind of an amazing queering of, it is not the Workmen's Club, which many people will know from the Keys. It is the organization that was there and moved to this other building, which is still a Working Men's Club, and they do this kind of fabulous, messy, you know, electric Spice Bag there. And I think that, like, a problem that the theatre has, full stop, across the board, is the energy and magic that happens in those impromptu nights. The theatre can't handle that. The theatre can't, you know, the theatre will go, well, yes, we'll put you into 6 months development on that, and we'll recreate the cabaret tables that you had. And you're just, no, just let me do the cabaret night on your stage, and then all of those people will come. And so there's the theatre, by its very nature, there is a blandification of some ideas, or an ironing out of queerness, which is inherently messy. And I think also what's happening is, when we go back to talk about mainstreaming, is, you know, if I saw some kid, you know, with their, you know, to rob a phrase from Panty, painted up like a stolen car in front of a lip syncing a song badly in front of a red glitter curtain, you know, I would often think, with one dodgy torch shone on them, I would like, well, that glitter curtain speaks to my soul, and how she, you know, lives inside that song talks to my trauma. And now if anyone sees that, they're kind of going, well, she ain't snatched enough, honey, okay? She needs to beat that face more. And that glitter curtain, that wouldn't pass the taste test. And you're like, hang on a second. There's, you know, RuPaul's Drag Race, you know, is totally kind of skewing our ideas of what queer performance, even for the people that go into it. The people that go into it are like, what? I have to do what? Because what I'm used to doing is shouting over drunk queers in a gay bar and lip syncing the song. And now you're making me sew this found fabric into a ball gown. But so I think that, you know, all of these things feed into the same thing of, like, you know, is how can the theatre capture, you know, and really support the messiness of queerness, which it seldom does, and sometimes it just does. Sometimes, you know, a night will be programmed or something. You know, I I think I saw David Hoyle was booked for a talk back after some period show at the Abbey, and the whole thing was just absolutely bonkers. And you just kind of think, oh well, that's it, that's actually the moment. And sometimes these addendums, the panties, the David Hoyles, sometimes the queer crashing the show, it is the thing that's electric.
Thanks so much. And we have a comment in from Elizabeth O'Sullivan who says, brilliant panel all around. Thanks to all three of you for your time. I love the idea of re-queering queerness in performance and the joy that can come to that, or can come from that. And I think, I wonder about something like RuPaul's Drag Race, and I wonder who is that framed for? I don't think it, you know what I mean? There's sort of there's a different sort of negotiation there. I remember I was teaching a class in performance studies last semester, and the students had to watch Paris is Burning and an episode of RuPaul and try and kind of like, it was like consider, I suppose, like a history that's sort of like erased for sort of commercial gain, but who is the audience? Who is that sort of benefiting? And the sort of, it's two different types of joyfulness, I think. It's sort of actual tangible joy in one case, and it's sort of like reproduced kind of like commercial sort of like static joy in another. And I suppose we might sort of like sum up on this kind of concept of re-queering and where do we go now, and what kind of spaces can queer performance and kind of queer like engagement in that sort of messiness claim. Like now that we are sitting here, hopefully looking forward to getting back into spaces with each other again, to be like literally messy, to you know, to actually like share that sort of like tangibility. What do we do now to sort of like preserve and kind of like move forward a kind of commitment to that kind of like re-queering, or to like be messy without having to kind of sanitize the work. Jamie, I might come to you and then Philip.
Yeah. How do we do this? I suppose, as Philly has said, you know, theatre, I suppose theatre in its traditional sense, in, you know, the big theatre buildings, the Abbey, the whatever, is kind of sanitized a little bit. But I think having those spaces and being willing to start those spaces and start those communities and be the person to push for these events like Scratch Nights, like Spice Bag sounds brilliant. So I might try and get down to it at some stage. But like, being brave enough to start those spaces in the first place, and that's kind of why I set up the theatre company when I did, is because I was like, there isn't really one of these for Galway, which surprised me. I was like, surely there's a lot of queer work here. Surely there's a lot of people that are working within this medium in Galway and the West. And I was kind of like, and yet there's not really a hub necessarily for this. Not a space, but like somebody that's gathering people together, kind of waving what is it, like waving like a tourist flag, being like this way, you know, all gather here. So that's why I started this thing, and I was like, we're gonna start these stories, we're gonna start getting this work seen, and we're gonna start being joyful about this absolute cack that we make, or the really beautiful, wonderful stuff that we come up with. And even in terms of like that really busted drag aesthetic, there's something really, really wonderful about that, because that feels really authentic. That is true queerness, because it's messy, it's unfinished, it's unhemmed, it's there just for the sake of the performance itself, and you kind of get lost in that rather than trying to get lost in the kind of perfectionism that is created from the RuPaul machine. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents on on the thing.
What about you, Philip? Like, where do we go now?
Well, the old world is over. It's gone. We've had our pause now, and people are open to new ways of seeing. So it's up to queers really just to take their position at the top table. And there is a sense of, you know, Jamie, you and I have been talking about this, but kind of really honing into your authenticity. Like we are so, as an audience, we are so attracted to people who are being entirely, like obviously we're attracted to people who are being other characters, but in performance that you kind of feel somebody is living inside this moment they're creating. And I think that we have been often forced to tone it down, do it a little bit differently, you know, shape it. And I think that it's time for queers to be as messy as possible. I say this as somebody who's, you know, hyper controlled in their life, but you know, I have enabled enough messy performance in my time to kind of go, well, that's where the electricity is. But you know, we really are moving into a new time for seeing and thinking and watching, and so, you know, makers, queers, we shape that. We say what's next.
There's no better note to end it on, I don't think, than that. I want to say thank you so much to Phil McMahon and Jamie Bigley for having this conversation. It's been really interesting to kind of like, you know, tease out these in sort of like a less formal setting as well. And thanks so much to those of you who attended and who contributed through the chat as well. This will be put up on YouTube at some stage in the coming days if you want to come back on any of those kind of tensions. And thank you so much to everybody. And we will leave it there.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.